I've been wearing and testing the Whoop Strap MG for 5 months now, and today we'll be systematically and scientifically testing the most important features of this Whoop Strap MG. This includes the heart rate tracking, sleep stage tracking, and a detailed comparison to the Oura Ring, one of the main competitors of the Whoop Strap. This should help you decide if the Whoop Strap is the right device for you, or if something cheaper or without a subscription is a better choice. To summarize, the Whoop Strap is pretty good in basically all categories, but only one of the best in terms of app and sleep stage tracking. So it tends to be pretty solid in most things that it does, but if you're focusing on one thing specifically, you're often better off getting another device, either because of price or just because for that one particular thing there's a better device out there. Now, the few things I think it's either best at or one of the best at is data presentation, so the app itself and the way it shows you your data, it helps you interpret your data. It's also one of the best at sort of motivating you to live a healthier life, which also has its downsides, as I'll show you later in this video, and sleep stage tracking. That the sleep stage tracking actually turned out to be better than in some of my previous tests, which is good to see that there's still improvements in the Whoop Strap potentially. Now, it can actually be hard to interpret health data, and the Whoop Strap has created one of the most useful apps in my opinion, though you should also not over-interpret or over-rely on anything you see in the app. Always combine your feelings with these sort of objective measurements, and also take into account that sometimes some of these measurements will just be dead wrong just because of circumstance. Maybe it shifted on your wrist, maybe something was off. So don't trust anything blindly, but combine it with all the other information you have. The only thing I don't like about the Whoop app at the moment is that they're continuously trying to upsell you if you don't already have the most expensive version, like the one I have right here, where they have grayed out sections in the app for the things that you are still missing, which I think does degrade the experience if you decide to get a cheaper or mid-tier Whoop Strap. And that brings me to the Whoop Strap pricing model. With Whoop, you don't pay upfront for your device, but you pay a monthly fee, and included with that is the device. You can choose out of 3 tiers. The cheapest is Whoop 1, which is described as professional grade fitness insights at our best price. Now, this lower tier actually doesn't include the Whoop MG like the one I have here, but the Whoop Strap 5.0, which is basically the same as the Whoop Strap MG without the ECG functionality, so they're more or less interchangeable except for ECG. Now, there's the middle tier called Whoop Peak, which is more focused on health in addition to fitness, so you also get these longevity insights. And finally, there's Whoop Life, which does include this Whoop Strap MG. Now again, the Whoop Strap 5.0 and MG are mostly similar except for the ECG, and this is their most powerful Whoop ever, and it delivers medical grade, which is what the MG stands for, health and performance insights. At least that's exactly how Whoop defines it. I tested Whoop Live myself, so this comes with the Whoop Strap MG, but I expect any testing I do also translates almost 1-to-1 to the other tiers as well, since the form factor, sensor hardware and software are basically all the same. But if you want to know more about the details of all these tiers and the different Whoop Strap models, you can check out my video up here, but you're probably more interested in the performance of this device. And I actually want to start by comparing the Whoop Strap data to the Oura Ring's data, because that reveals something really interesting in my opinion. But before getting to that, I should mention that there are some features I couldn't or haven't tested yet in detail, like the biological age estimation, which is just almost impossible to test unless maybe I had a lot of resources and a large test population. I also tried the blood pressure feature, but I just found it very unreliable, so I stopped testing it at some point. I might do a longer term test, but for now I think if you want to know your blood pressure, just get a blood pressure cuff, because I really think actual blood pressure values cannot be reliably measured by any wearable at this point, at least based on my experience. But as I said, let's compare the Whoop Strap to the detailed metrics of the Oura Ring. And in comparing the Oura Ring to the Whoop Strap, let's start with some of the basic metrics that should be more or less the same between the two. And one of the ones that should be very similar is the resting heart rate. So basically, how many times a minute does your heart beat when you're at rest, which is usually measured during the night by both of these devices. Now, along the horizontal axis is the Oura Ring, and along the vertical axis is the Whoop Strap. And I took the average resting heart rate as measured by the Oura Ring. So not the lowest one, but the average, and then the resting heart rate by the Whoop Strap. And these are generally similar, though it does seem that that average resting heart rate of the Oura Ring is a bit higher. So probably the Whoop strap calculates it a bit differently, where it doesn't take the average over the night, but generally both agree very well. So there's a very strong correlation between the two, and you wouldn't draw any other conclusions if you follow your trends over the years, depending on whether you use an Oura Ring or a Whoop strap. So these are basically more or less identical. However, heart rate variability is actually a bit harder to measure, which you can see right here. However, this also looks very similar between the two devices. Not quite as similar, but still more than similar enough that it doesn't really matter which of the two you use. So again, we have the Oura Ring along the horizontal axis, the Whoop strap along the vertical axis, and the blue line would indicate perfect agreement, where each dot is a single night of measurements. Now I only have 74 nights of data to work with, and that's because data export of the Whoop strap is just really bad. I had major issues with it. In the end, I got an export from I think July or August that more or less worked. I tried to do a new one now, but I always have issues with this, so please Whoop fix this. My latest export even had empty data frames, which was just not something I could work with. But still, I think we can generally say that these sort of basic metrics like resting heart rate or heart rate variability will give you the same sort of data. And if you get higher or lower between different days, and you would get mostly the same results, whether or not you use the Oura Ring or the Whoop strap. However, one metric that I did find to be different is the skin temperature, which you can see right here. So we have the Oura skin temperature deviation in degrees Celsius along the horizontal axis, and the Whoop strap along the vertical axis. I should actually put this in frame a little bit better. So we have the Whoop strap absolute temperature here. This is the only one I could find. And Oura Ring measures the deviation compared to your baseline. Now here I didn't have major changes in my temperature. I never had a fever. So I think here, because it's either measuring on my biceps or my finger, and I never had really significant temperature increases or decreases, neither really detected anything in this period as in a too high or low temperature. So nothing was here to be detected. And you can see sort of the measurement noise here. So here I would really need some days with fever, for instance, to say whether or not these worked. For now, we can say that for both, a deviation of about a degree Celsius doesn't mean much, which I think is 2 degrees Fahrenheit, I'm not too sure. But in that range, I wouldn't really trust the measurements. Only a significant increase is really something to look out for. So those are the more, let's say, objective measurements that you can do. But Oura and Whoop also calculate a sleep score and a readiness or recovery score. So let's also compare those, and let's start with the sleep score. And here we have that comparison of the sleep scores. So the Oura Ring along the horizontal axis again, and the Whoop strap along the vertical axis, where we generally do see an agreement between the two scores. But of course, their ranges are different. So my sleep score according to Whoop was usually between 70 and let's say 100. Whereas for Oura, it was usually between 60 and 90. So sort of a shift because they just calculate their score differently, but probably because both of them to a degree depend on your sleep stages, but also your total sleep duration, your sleep consistency. They're largely the same, at least not vastly different. So it does seem that there might still be, even if you normalize for how they are different systematically, like a 10-point difference or so. Overall, it does seem that they largely use and give the same information. However, one other important metric of the Whoop is the recovery score, and of Oura is the readiness score, which I think should be somewhat related at least. They're not doing exactly the same thing, but I did want to see if they are comparable. So let's take a look. And that's plotted right here. So again, in blue would be perfect agreement between the two, but we don't expect them to perfectly agree. So I just added it here, but it's not that important. We mostly want to see, is there a correlation between the two? And yes, there is, but they do seem to be measuring very different things. So both these scores have a formula in the background that use a lot of other metrics to then calculate either the Oura readiness score here along the horizontal axis or the Whoop recovery score along the vertical axis. And even though generally a very low readiness score also gives a low recovery score, and a really high recovery score does tend to associate somewhat with a high readiness score, I do think they're calculating something somewhat different. So they're just slightly different metrics trying to tell you somewhat the same thing. But here you can see they're not as similar as one might think. But what is your experience? How do you actually use either your Oura readiness score or your Whoop recovery score? Do you actually use it, and how do you interpret this? So these are the comparisons I wanted to show you between the Oura Ring and the Whoop strap. So let's now move on to some more testing. So if you compare the Oura Ring to the Whoop strap, in terms of raw data, you get more or less the same results, at least in broad strokes. So no matter which device you have, I don't think you will make different decisions about your day. The one exception is potentially this temperature measurement. But again, I didn't have any fevers during this testing period, so it's hard to say how big the difference actually is. I think both of them basically only measured noise more or less in that period. Now, we did see that the sleep score and especially this sort of recovery or readiness score are very different. And I have no way of really saying if the Oura Ring score or the Whoop strap score is more useful at the moment. The only way I can think of is to also record subjective measures of how I felt that day and compare those to the Oura and Whoop scores. But I would have to then stay blind to my Oura Ring and Whoop scores, which is kind of hard since I actually use both in daily life. If some people are actually willing to do this for maybe a month, we can set up a testing cohort with certain parameters and I would collect that data and show the results in a video. So if you're interested, let me know in the comments below. If we get 4 or 5 people with both an Oura Ring and a Whoop strap, that should be pretty interesting. But I actually don't know how many people have both the Oura Ring and the Whoop strap and would be willing to stay blind to their scores for maybe a month, or at least not look at them until the day after. But okay, if you're interested, let me know in the comments below. Let's next take a look at something that we can judge better how good it actually is: the heart rate tracking during exercise. And here the Whoop strap does do a lot better than the Oura Ring. And as always, let's start with one of the easier exercises for a device to track indoor cycling, where you have the reference device, so the Polar H10 along the horizontal axis, and the Whoop strap MG worn on the biceps along the vertical axis, where each dot is a single heart rate measurement, and if they perfectly agree, all values should be along or close to the blue line. And overall, this looks very good, so most points are on or close to the blue line. Now, the reason we're using the Polar H10 as a reference because that has been shown to be very reliable in heart rate tracking, and there have been several scientific studies about this. So if worn well, this should give a really reliable heart rate measurement. And as I said, the Whoop strap MG generally agrees very well with the Polar H10. Though there were a few moments where I detected a too low heart rate, so maybe it had some delays in picking up on changes in heart rate. We'll look at that in a second. However, we can see that the correlation is pretty good at 0.98. Now, over the last, let's say, 5 years that I've been doing this testing, the heart rate tracking of many devices have gotten better and better. Before, 0.98 would have been a really impressive correlation value, but now there are more and more devices sort of in that area, and some are even doing better. Let's first take a look at some of the individual spinning sessions to see why it sometimes still detected a too low heart rate. And let's then compare to the competition. Now, I want to show you a few example spinning sessions. So here we have the clock time along the horizontal axis with the reference in blue-green and the Whoop strap MG in red. And as is pretty clear, mostly there's a good agreement. Some small deviations, but this session was almost perfect. This session also looks really good, but sometimes there's a small delay in picking up on that increase in heart rate, which is probably why we sometimes saw a too low heart rate. However, for this session, we actually see that in the beginning it struggled a little bit. So maybe my skin was still warming up and that's why it struggled in the beginning. So later on it was really good. This session is again almost perfect. Also here, also perfect agreement with sometimes a really small delay in picking up on that increase in heart rate. And here again, almost perfect with only here the dip not being fully detected. So the major deviations we saw were actually based on this session. But otherwise, since I included a total of 6 spinning sessions in this overview, we see that 5 out of 6 were basically perfect, so this might have been a fluke. But let's now compare this performance to that of many other devices out there, which is plotted right here, with the Whoop strap MG plotted in red, and the better the agreement to the reference, the more to the top right devices are. And as is pretty clear, the Whoop strap MG is not amongst the best performers, but it still has a high correlation. So let's zoom into just the better performing devices. So these are just the devices with a correlation of 0.95 or higher. And amongst these, the Whoop strap MG is doing pretty well, also close to my original testing of the Whoop strap MG, so nothing seems to have improved or gotten worse. Now, it's not as good as, for instance, the Amazfit Helio strap worn on either the biceps or the wrist, at least based on my initial testing of that device. And the best devices out there are different Apple Watches. The Pixel Watch is actually also doing really well. Also, the new Pixel Watch 4 did quite well. So overall, it's good enough, I think, for indoor cycling, though there are definitely better devices out there if you want the most accurate heart rate tracking. Generally, Apple Watches, like I said, do really well, but also some Huawei devices, the Pixel Watch, those are the main ones I would recommend. But the Whoop Strap MG is definitely good enough, and for indoor cycling there are actually quite a few options of devices you can choose from. Now before getting to the heart rate testing during running, let's first mention some of the limitations in my testing. First of all, I just tested the Whoop Strap on myself, at least in this video, and not on others. I am actually testing it on my colleague Raphael as well, and I will release a separate video on that in a month or two, so we'll also have a second test subject at that point, but it's still limited. Second, I wore the Whoop Strap on my biceps for this testing. This is just because it's easy for me and where I prefer to wear it long term, and I could see some influence on the results. I think it mostly positively influences the heart rate tracking performance, so on the wrist it might actually do slightly worse, so keep that in mind. And third, I do have an affiliate link for the Whoop Strap in the description below. But Whoop doesn't know I'm making this video, they're not sponsoring or influencing it, and as you will see, I'm not universally positive about Whoop. I think I'm still unbiased, but I still wanted to mention it. But let's now get to the results for running. Now for running, the results are not quite as good as we saw for indoor cycling. Most of the time it appears to do well, but in some moments it detects a too high heart rate. And a too high heart rate for running often means cadence lock, where a watch or device is measuring the frequency at which you're running and not the frequency of your heart rate. So because it gets an extra periodic signal, it cannot always determine which is your heart rate and which is your running frequency. And I think for some runs this must have been an issue. This also means that the correlation is now a bit lower, but let's take a look at those individual runs. Again, I included 6 runs in this overview, so my 6 most recent runs. Let's have a look. So this first run, we don't see any major issues, maybe really small deviations, but otherwise all intervals were captured. Second run, also really good, so this was still in September when the weather was decently good. Then it got a bit colder, and here we have the first run where in the beginning we see some issues. So I slowly warmed up, and in this time in the beginning I think it was measuring my running frequency, and then probably as my biceps got warmer just from running and the blood flow got better, it was able to detect my heart rate accurately. However, here it struggled in the beginning. For this session also a minor struggle in the beginning. Again, I suspect it was maybe because my body was still warming up and it really had a bit more trouble detecting that blood flow, whereas later on it's almost perfect. And again here also in the beginning the major deviation, and after that it's really good. So maybe this is really personal to me and my body where it needs to warm up, but it's interesting that it's always in the beginning. And again, also for this final interval session, it only struggled in the beginning and later on it did really well. So not a major problem, and it appears to be only in the beginning of my run. I'm not sure how it would do for you, but this is what I see in my testing. It's not terrible, but I've seen better. I've also seen a lot worse though. So let's put this in an overview of many other devices I've tested before. So you can see that right here. Again, we use that correlation value, which was 0.93 in this case for running with the Whoop Strap MG, which is actually very close to some previous testing I did with the Whoop Strap MG on my wrist. So it's sort of in the middle of all devices, not doing terrible, probably having a good enough correlation, but in the beginning of my run I would be a bit more careful in interpreting that data. But let's zoom in a bit. So that zoomed in view is displayed right here. So with just the devices of a correlation of 0.9 or higher, and as is pretty clear, it's not terrible, but there are definitely better devices out there. And again, Apple Watches are doing really well. The Pixel Watch 3, also the Pixel Watch 4 did quite okay. But check out my Pixel Watch review for that. I had one weird run, but otherwise the Pixel Watch was almost perfect. And interestingly, my previous testing of the Whoop Strap MG might have done a little bit better. I was testing 2 at the same time. And we can actually see that the Amazfit Helio strap on the biceps did do a lot better. Again, this was tested in a warmer period, so then maybe the Whoop Strap MG also wouldn't have these issues. Overall, probably good enough, but definitely not perfect. And if it's purely heart rate tracking you're interested in, there are probably better devices out there. So for running, I definitely encountered some issues with the Whoop Strap. They were mostly there in the first half of the run and only present in about half of the runs. It could be that as my body was warming up, the signal became easier to measure because the blood flow got better, and that's why it was struggling in the beginning. I'm not sure if that's the case or not. Still, whether or not the performance I showed is good enough for you is of course for you to decide. But let's let's next take a look at what is often even a harder exercise for devices to track: outdoor cycling. And here we have that overview for cycling outside, where we do see that most points are somewhat close to the blue line or really on the blue line, but there's also quite a few moments it seems where it detects a too low heart rate. And this is what we often see for cycling for some devices, where if there's a lot of tension on my wrist, it really takes a while for it to pick up on changes in my heart rate, which I suspect is what's going on here. We can also see that the correlation is not great, but also not terrible at 0.98. But this is the worst we've seen so far. So let's take a look at some of the individual bike rides. I actually included a total of 16 bike rides, some on my road bike, but most on my city bike. So let's have a look. So here we have one road bike ride that I did with, again, the Whoopstrap MG in red, which generally looked pretty good. However, near the end, it really missed one of the peaks in my heart rate. So definitely not perfect. Another road bike ride, and this actually doesn't look quite as good. I think this might have actually been auto-detected, but still not looking that great. So it often detected a too low heart rate at the peaks of my heart rate. This road bike ride looks quite good. This is almost perfect. Also, this bike ride here's not too bad. Here it actually looks almost perfect again. However, this bike ride doesn't look very good. So in the beginning it was quite okay. Still, it missed one peak right here. However, in the middle it missed two of the peaks on my heart rate. So I think here I was going up the mountain quite a bit faster and it really didn't detect this. And now we have some city bike rides. So this one looks okay, though it missed a few of the details. This one is also probably good enough. Here it missed a lot of the peaks in my heart rate. It was quite a short bike ride, but we can see it struggled. Here it's okay, missing some of the details. Again, it's okay, not great. Also not perfect by any means. This is okay at the end, not great in the beginning. Also okay, so you sort of get the feeling it misses some of the details or some of the peaks in my heart rate partially. It's not terrible, I've definitely seen worse. And you can see that in this overview right here. So again, the better the agreement to the reference, the more to the top right the device is. And the Whoopstrap is again in the middle or maybe second or third tier of devices. Not great, not terrible. If we zoom into just some of the medium to better performing devices, it's actually quite close to my original testing of the Whoopstrap MG and also quite close to my testing of the Whoopstrap 5 I initially did. So very consistent results, at least on me. But again, the Pixel Watch 3, probably the Pixel Watch 4, the Apple Watch, the Amazfit Helio strap worn on the biceps, all of these are doing better than the Whoopstrap. So for purely heart rate tracking, I'm not sure if you should get the Whoopstrap. At least, of course, this is based on my body and my testing. I always recommend also checking out other reviewers. So for cycling outside, the results are not terrible, but also not good. Again, here I think the Whoop is sort of second or mid-tier. Likely good enough for a significant part of people looking for such a device, but definitely having some issues. Next, let's take a look at the hardest exercise for a device to track: weightlifting. And here we have that overview for weightlifting, which looks as we've seen for many other devices out there, where in the lower heart rate range is pretty good, but the moment my heart rate increases, it struggles. And it struggles because it increases when I put tension on my arms and I'm actually starting a set. So I'm pretty sure it wasn't able to detect the peaks in my heart rate, but let's check. And indeed, we can see that the peaks in my heart rate generally weren't detected by the Whoopstrap. Same for this session, same for this session, and also this last example. For me, at least, the peaks in my heart rate aren't detected by the Whoopstrap, even when worn on my biceps. Now, part of that is, of course, because these were all upper body workouts, so there would always be tension on my biceps. But overall, I'm really not happy with this for weightlifting. But in general, no device does really well for weightlifting. Just use a chest strap, jogs for short, if you want to accurately track your heart rate during any exercise, but especially during weightlifting. So for weightlifting, I would say the results are definitely not good enough. If you care about your heart rate during weightlifting, which is probably less important than your heart rate during cycling or running, I would recommend jogs. Just use a chest strap. Chest straps are generally the most reliable way of measuring your heart rate in most conditions, at least. Of course, there's limitations there, but if you care about heart rate tracking a lot, the best way is an ECG chest strap. So that was heart rate tracking during exercise, but in addition to tracking your workouts, the Whoopstrap also tracks your sleep. So how good are the sleep stage tracking results? Or in other words, can the Whoopstrap track your deep sleep, light sleep, and REM sleep? Well, let's take a look. And here's an overview of the sleep stage tracking results. with the reference device on top, which is the Z-Max EEG headband, which was specifically designed for sleep tracking and is used in several scientific studies. It can actually measure my brain waves and it's scored based on that. It's not perfect, but good enough to give us a general impression which devices are good at sleep stage tracking and which are not so good. And on the left right here, we have the sleep stages as tracked by the Whoop Strap MG worn on my biceps. And I normalized each of the columns right here to 100%, meaning that if they would perfectly agree, all values on the diagonal here should be 100%. Now, first of all, we see that about 87% of what was deep sleep according to the reference was also deep sleep according to the Whoop Strap, so that's really good. This is one of the highest values I've seen. However, light sleep agreement is not quite as good at about 65%, meaning that quite a bit of extra deep sleep is likely detected by the Whoop Strap and also quite a bit of extra REM sleep. Now, REM sleep detection overall is quite okay. So in terms of what percentage of the REM sleep according to the reference is also detected by the Whoop Strap, that's 78%, which is pretty decent. However, because you have so much light sleep, these 16% and 17% right here weigh quite heavily. So I do suspect that the Whoop Strap detects a bit more deep sleep and REM sleep in total than the reference device. Overall though, this is pretty solid performance. And we can actually compare this performance to that of many other devices out there. And I should mention that all the sleep stage tracking results for the Whoop Strap MG right here are based on 30 nights of data. And here we have an overview of many of the other devices I've tested in the past, with the average agreement over those 3 sleep stages along the horizontal axis and the worst out of the 3 along the vertical axis. So that means the better the agreement with the reference device, the more to the top right the device is. So the best performing devices are up here. And we have the Whoop Strap MG marked in green right here. So all the green marked devices were tested against the Z-Max EEG reference and the others were tested against other references. So let's focus on the green marked ones right here. And we can see that it's one of the better performing devices. It's very close to my testing of the Oura Ring 3 and the Oura Ring 4. Also very close to the Pixel Watch 4 and the Pixel Watch 3 and different Apple devices, the H-Sleep Pod and the Sleep 2 or Nuco app. So based on this, the Whoop Strap has actually improved compared to my previous testing of the Whoop Strap 4.0 right here. Though I think in my last testing of the Whoop Strap 4.0, I had some minor issues with the reference that are now fixed. So it might have already been a bit better than what this overview is suggesting. However, it's pretty clear that based on these 30 nights of data, the Whoop Strap is really a pretty solid sleep stage tracker, at least based on me and my testing. Now, if you want the cheapest good sleep stage tracking, you should probably get a Fitbit device or an older Pixel Watch. These have really good sleep stage tracking, don't require a subscription, and are really not that expensive. There was recently an update to the sleep stage tracking which made them a lot better. Now, if you're on iOS, the Apple Watch is also a good option and doesn't require a subscription. Then there's the Nuco Sleep 2 app, but this does also require a subscription. Now, as you can see, based on my testing at least, the Oura Ring and the Whoop Strap are now pretty much on par in terms of sleep stage tracking, so I'm quite happy with that. There was a recent paper that showed that the Oura Ring might be a little bit better, though they use another metric for this, which also has up or down sides. I might make a separate video about that. And finally, there's also the H-Sleep Pod, which also requires a subscription, which is my favorite overall sleep device that I use myself on a daily basis. It's not actually a device you wear on your body. It's something that goes around your mattress and can actively heat and cool each side of the bed independently, so you and your potential partner can sleep at your preferred temperature. I'm, for instance, a very hot sleeper, so I often need the bed to be cooled down. It's really my favorite sleep improvement device, and it can also, without you having to wear anything, accurately track your resting heart rate, your heart rate variability, and your sleep stages. But it's super expensive. Now, if you do decide to get it, never get it on credit. Now, I think you should never get any of these health devices on credit, so only buy it if you can really afford it. But if you want to support the channel and get the best discount possible, you can use my affiliate link up here or down here. But overall, like I said, all the devices I so far mentioned, from the Whoop Strap to the Oura Ring, to Fitbit devices, to Apple Watches, to the H-Sleep Pod, to the Sleep 2 app, all of these will give you reliable enough sleep stage tracking, at least based on my testing. Again, for some people, some of these devices might not work. I am working on some bigger sleep testing to be released soon. but I'm actually very happy with this performance of the Whoop Strap MG. And I do expect you will get the exact same results with the Whoop Strap 5.0. So no matter which of the Whoop Strap subscriptions you get, I do think you'll get the same sleep stage tracking performance. So for sleep stage tracking, the results were actually better than I expected. And this updated sleep stage tracking algorithm that Whoop launched maybe 9 months ago or so actually did better than I expected in this test. It does about the same now as the Oura Ring, at least based on my testing, which I'm happy to see. Potentially Apple, H-Sleep and the Pixel Watch are doing ever so slightly better based on my testing, but it's hard to say and it's maybe still in sort of that noise area. I'm just really happy with the results for any of these devices. Now, before drawing my final conclusions and talking about other testing I did and the things that are right and wrong with the Whoop strap, I have a quick request for you. Running this channel next to my full-time job as a scientist is neither easy or cheap. I buy most devices myself and also have to pay my editor Alex. If you want to support, there's multiple ways of doing that. If you do end up getting a Whoop strap, you get the best discount possible with my affiliate link up here or down here, which supports your wallet and it supports the channel at the same time. Or if you buy anything at all on Amazon, if you first click my general Amazon link, I also get a small commission and it doesn't cost you any extra. And there are many more affiliate links down below to give you the best discount possible. Also, you can become a YouTube member, which is like Patreon on YouTube, which gives you early access to some of my videos. Now, thanks for considering any of these, and let's get back to the Whoop strap testing. In summary, I would say the heart rate tracking is okay. It's not bad, but also not great. The sleep stage tracking is actually also really good. I'm not too sure why it did slightly better now than in my previous testing, which was with the Whoop strap 4.0, but should have been the same algorithm as far as we know at least. However, based on this testing, the Whoop strap is now as good, at least on me, as the Oura Ring, and Whoop has made it into the top brands in the sleep stage test. In terms of app, I do think that Whoop has one of the best apps out there. It easily gives you both an overview of all your statistics in the short term, so in terms of health and stress monitor, but also has a focus on more of that long-term statistics, mainly in the form of your health span. This is mainly captured in what Whoop calls your biological age. It's some calculation that they do. It's basically supposed to be a representation of how healthy you are compared to your age group, at least is my opinion. I don't think it can claim to be saying that your body is that many years younger in terms of your actual full biology. For instance, my Whoop age at the moment is 25.9, so 11.3 years younger than I actually am at 37. However, I don't think this could actually mean I would live 11.3 years longer because of this. And there are probably plenty of biological processes in my body that likely well reflect my true chronological age. Also, the way that Whoop actually calculates this age is proprietary, and as far as I could find out, not based on any independent science in particular. So take it with a big grain of salt. However, that doesn't mean there's no actual value in it. I actually regularly use it, maybe on a weekly basis I check it. And what I like about it is that it gives you clear categories to improve on. And all these individual categories are likely well-established things that are linked to living a healthier life and having a somewhat healthier body, let's say. It basically just wants you to get enough and consistent sleep, do cardio exercises, do strength training, and not have too much fat mass. And it tracks this based on your activities, your sleep schedule, and things like your resting heart rate. So overall, I just see it as a gamified way of making you live more healthily and easily seeing some of your most important metrics in terms of long-term health. However, if you know that you're somebody who gets obsessed with these metrics, it might actually lead to unhealthy behavior with these things, and you get stressed for no reason if they're not as good as they were last week. So in that case, you might want to think twice about starting to use it. Also, based on admittedly my subjective experience in using both Whoop, the Oura Ring, and the H-Sleep Pod every day, I do feel that Whoop tends to more quickly call some metrics out of range compared to competitors like Oura and H-Sleep, for instance your resting heart rate or your heart rate variability, which gives you an orange warning and you might get worried even though you feel fine. So I recommend always combining your own feelings with the objective measurements that these kind of devices provide and not blindly following either of the two. Just take all reliable information that you can and weigh it based on your past experience with it. Overall, I am really happy with my Whoop strap and I use it every day. I think it's one of the best complete devices out there, and where it shines is the app, the sleep tracking, and the versatility for me in wearing it anywhere. So I mostly wear it on my biceps, but I like that I can also wear it on my wrist or even in my boxer shorts, for instance. However, if you should get it, really depends on your priorities. If you're purely interested in heart rate tracking, the Amazfit Helio strap is likely a better choice, and it's also a lot cheaper. Or if you only care about sleep and health, I do think the Oura Ring is a bit easier to wear and also has a great app. Though I should note there that I did notice that the battery life of the Oura Ring is a lot worse than the Whoop strap. I do have to remember to charge my Oura Ring more than once a week, whereas my Whoop strap I can wear for several weeks without charging it, which I do think is a big benefit now with the Whoop strap 5 and Whoop strap MG compared to the previous generation. And of course, with something like the Whoop strap, you don't get a screen, which is the point for some people, but just take that into account. If you're gonna do an exercise, you cannot start it from the Whoop strap, it might auto-detect it. But if you want to accurately track all your workouts and you don't want to take your phone with you, then also think twice about it. And it also doesn't have GPS tracking built in, so for that you also need your phone. So for avid runners who don't want to bring their phone, that might be a no-go. For the best GPS tracking, I recommend Garmin, Chorus, Suunto, or the Apple Watch Ultra 3 at this point. Now, if you do end up getting a Whoop strap, an Oura Ring, an Apple Watch, an HD Pod, another device, or anything at all on Amazon for that matter, even something as small as new kitchen sponges, you want to support the channel and at the same time support your wallet, there are different affiliate links in the description below, many of which give you the best discount possible and none of them cost you any extra. Now, given that you watched this whole video on the Whoop strap, check out this video on the HD Pod or this video on the Helio strap.